What is up, coordination? On the pod today, we are talking about an AI DAO simulator. I feel like it's the ultimate nerd snipe. This is one of the coolest episodes that we've done. My guest today is James Pollack, who, as an artist and programmer, has worked for various startups and agencies building software and experiences in the past. We connected because of his interest in complex systems and how agent-based modeling and DAOs could intersect. So basically, at a high level, this episode is about a DAO governance simulator that James has built. Basically, what if you took 100 different AIs and you gave them tokens and you gave them a governance forum to argue in? What kind of things would you learn about DAO governance from that? So, really interesting design space that connects a lot of the recent trends around LLMs and artificial intelligence with the things that we breathe every day, which is DAOs, Web3, decentralized governance, and protocols. So, in this space, we often talk about how we're speedrunning the history of coordination and of finance. Well, we could speedrun it even faster if we set forward a bunch of AIs to go argue in our governance forums and find the optimal parameters for DAO coordination so that we don't have to do it ourselves. So really interesting design space. And James and I have been connected for 3 to 6 months, sort of nerding out on these ideas. And James is actually building a code base that's helping to explore some of these ideas. So coordination, I think this is a really fun episode that combines some of the latest thinking on AI and DAOs. And if we are successful, we will be speedrunning the design space of what's possible in DAO coordination using AIs, which, wow, the future is here. It's just so cool. So coordination, without further ado, I give you James Pollack. Enjoy.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
What's up, James?
Hey, how are you, Kevin?
I'm pretty good. I'm excited to get weird. You ready to get weird?
Yeah, same. I've been looking forward to our conversation since we first met a couple months ago.
Yeah, same. So basically, maybe a good jumping off point would be for you to tell us what you've been building this DAO simulator.
Sure. So I've been working on an agent-based model. And an agent-based model is a computer program where you can code a bunch of, I don't want to use the word in the definition, so instead of agents, I'll say like characters. You can think of them like characters in a video game. And you give them roles and rules of how they should behave. And then you run time through this simulation. So there's a bunch of time steps. And at every step, these agents make different decisions about what they should do based on the rules that you've given them. And the situation that I've decided to put these characters in is that they're all members of a decentralized autonomous organization. So the DAO members are represented by different agent classes, and they can create proposals, vote on them, invest in projects, a bunch of other activities. And the simulation also incorporates treasury management, token pricing, revenue distribution, kind of things that happen at the level of the DAO itself, which is one agent, and then at the level of the individual DAO members, who are your investors and delegators and developers.
Yeah. I just think it's so cool, and I can't wait to unfurl the possibility space here. So, I think that the reason that you and I got connected was that on February 2nd, I wrote this post on the Super Modular Community Forum about a DAO AI governance simulation toolkit, which I called DAGs, just to try to meme it. But so basically, what I wrote was we could build an AI DAO toolkit where I could spin up 100 different AIs, give them all tokens, and set each AI to maximize their token balances, give them a governance forum to argue in, and let them vote on snapshot and tally. And I want to run like 10,000 different AI DAOs with slightly different starting conditions and like parameters for the agents, like they're friendly or adversarial, and see how those DAOs evolve differently. So basically, we're doing a parameter sweep on governance frameworks, and then you can start to like introduce different rules to governance, or like maybe you introduce quadratic funding to the DAO, and you see how that affects the agent's behavior. And like once you've done a like this sweep of different setups, you could find optimal governance setups across the design space of governance. And like to me, that's the exciting idea here, is that instead of my friends having to argue in the governance forum over what's what in their DAO, what if we could have a bunch of AIs simulate that and then find the optimal governance setups, and for our human DAOs actually set up our human DAOs that way. So that was, so I wrote this post, and then you and I got connected and just sort of nerded out from there. And I'm just I guess that's A, to give the reader the backstory of how we got connected, but B, just this design space feels like it's so exciting to me. And I'd be curious, maybe to volley back to you, what got you excited about this design space?
Um, I think I had almost the exact same realization as you, which is that there's actually very little data about this space, and that generating it takes time and money in real people's lives. And running experiments on actual people in a DAO can be very painful for those people. And
Yeah, so I've heard.
discovering whether a certain kind of voting system, or penalties or rewards for behaving different ways inside of the DAO, or its structure itself, how many members, whether you have a native token. These are things that are not easily changed, right? So if you want to test, how your DAO would run with its own token or not, that's quite hard to do. So I also think that this opportunity to explore that design space, I love that you call it a hyper parameter sweep, the like technical term in some of the Python I'm using called it batch running, but absolutely same thing. You want to see, in the matrix of this choice and this choice that you could make, how does it work when you choose A and B? How does it work when you choose A and C? So on and so forth. And I think I think that maybe a little bit unlike you, I'm not so certain that we will be able to find those perfect, platonic ideals of what a DAO should be. I think that a lot of that will depend on what your particular, goals are. Um, eh, eh, and that's because the agent-based models are typically they're a source for generating synthetic data. So we're modeling a system. It's not the real system. It's not going to necessarily have predictive properties, but that is sort of a really fun thing to work on. Is like, where do you put the slider as far as how synthetic is our data? You mentioned perhaps letting your agents discuss things on a forum. Well, do you model that forum to just be a simple, like somebody left a positive, negative comment? Do you maybe build it out more
Mm,
fully so that the agents can talk to each other with LLMs? Or do you actually plug it into a real forum and let your agents make posts and interact with real people? I think what you
mhm.
decide to do for that will depend on what your goals are. Um, but it's just exciting to be able to change those things. I've seen DAOs try to do these, and uh, people make these big decisions with hundreds of millions of dollars under management with almost no
Right.
insight into it. So I'm just hoping, even if a tool like this isn't entirely predictive, I'm hoping that it'll at least give people some insight and help them have a better decision making sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I can imagine a future in which, say I'm on the governance or the steward council at DAO X. Um, we could I'm imagining a future in which this tool is available, and you can ingest the parameters of the setup of the DAO, and maybe ingest the forum posts that have been on the DAO, and that sets the starting conditions in the DAO governance framework to be localized to whatever DAO X
Yep.
values and cultural norms and setup is. And maybe you could instead of sweeping the entire parameter space, you could sort of sweep the space around it and say, what would happen if we cut our proposal threshold
Yep.
in half, or if we changed our culture such that people were 20% friendlier, or we
Mm.
introduced quadratic funding or something like that. To me, that's where it gets really interesting. And yeah, maybe it's not completely predictive, but it is an interesting way of simulating DAO governance changes before you just YOLO make them live.
Right. I think you bring up a great point that there could be kind of two different users or different times somebody might be trying to use this. One is you've got a DAO, it exists, you're thinking about making a change. In that case, like, yeah, it's very hard to change the ship if it's already underway. But maybe people thinking about setting up new DAOs, I think that's a situation where your entire hyperparameter sweep would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, totally. Well, so can you take us into what you built? So
Sure.
for the listeners, if you click into the GitHub, you can see this code that James has put together around the DAO simulation framework, and I'm looking at the README now. So take us on a deep dive of what you built.
For sure. So agent-based models you can build in a variety of frameworks. The one that I had used previously was called NetLogo. That's a big one people learn when they are starting agent-based modelings, but it's based on the JVM on Java. So it's not as like interoperable as you'd like. So for this project, I used a different agent-based modeling framework. This one's based in Python. It's called Mesa, which is great. You want to be in Python. That's where all the cool machine learning stuff and generative things are happening. So being able to be in Python and plug in is super exciting. Um, so I've built agent-based models before, but maybe not one quite this big or complex. So yeah, I started with just sort of a base class of like a DAO member. What does everybody need to do? They vote, they comment on proposals, they hold tokens, and they have a reputation. Um, Even some of these base assumptions, like you're already making choices for the DAO, right? Like there's a reputation and
Right.
we're keeping track of it with points. Like already I can think of a ton of different ways to keep track of reputation. It can be kind of paralyzing because you want to give people, every option. But you do just have to make a couple arbitrary choices to get started and then hopefully leave in some levers so you can come back and tweak that stuff later. Um, and so from the DAO member, I thought about some other roles of people in DAOs and the things they might do. So we have like developers who be brought in to like build and maintain projects. Investors invest in proposals and projects. I've even modeled like passive members, people who like hold tokens, and they might vote, but they're not really like getting involved in projects and stuff. And the proposal creators who create and submit proposals, regulators ensure compliance with external regulations and requirements, service providers. That's similar to a developer, but it might be like an external developer, or if you need something translated. Um, and I also have validators, arbitrators, delegators. Looking at this list, I think going back, if I was starting over, I look at this and I think to myself, like people often hold multiple roles in a DAO. So this is one of those like base assumptions, like does everybody fall neatly into one class of like, I'm an arbitrator or I'm a developer? Maybe people's roles change and this model doesn't quite account for that yet, or maybe people hold multiple roles. So starting with it's got about 10 different classes and all the roles are individual roles. It's Once you start running the model, it'll be interesting because your developers are going to like develop. They're not going to be investing in things, but I think in the real world, somebody can be both an investor and a developer. So I see some potential for that growing out later. Um, so
If
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I meant to interrupt. I was going to say, like, in a way, we're getting into some of the fundamental trade-offs when it comes to modeling complex systems, of which all economies and social systems are. It's really hard when you've got these agent-based systems and they're intelligent agents to make productive assumptions about who is what and in what ways they behave. And I think that that's kind of one of the challenges here is having the right level of abstraction that's not too reductionist with each of these. And I know from my experience working with say Gitcoin DAO, which I'm now disaffiliated from, but I've watched it from the outside, is that some of the people who are services providers are also proposal creators, are also developers, are also delegators, and you're almost like overloading a superclass at that point with different behavior types. So yeah, just a meta commentary about complex systems there.
And a totally valid one, and one that makes me realize it's important to point out that these agents, sort of out of the box, they're not AI. They have like rules. They're responding to conditions. You're saying, if token price is more than X, do this. If it's less than X, do that. So in that sense, like out of the box, they're not very intelligent. What is great about being in this environment, and actually all of the cool complex system stuff happening lately, is that um, your agents can actually be plugged into these systems, like um, generative AI for creating those behaviors. You could generate, 200 different behaviors and plug those in and have the agents pick from those. Or you could plug in reinforcement learning and give your agents a,
Right.
reward function. And so they could actually change their behaviors on that. Or let them be self-reflexive and actually modify their behavior while it's running. This simulation is not there yet, but that is why I built it in Python, is so that we have the potential. Every time you call a step on an agent, that's how it works, as a time step. But when we step the developer, we don't just have to have them do the rules that we wrote at the beginning of the simulation. If we've plugged in the ability for them to generate new strategies, try them out, kill the ones that don't work, and ride with the ones that do, yeah, then stuff's going to get weird. Then we're going to see some stuff in that hyperparameter space that like we didn't even know existed, because they're going to be creating new parameters as they go. So um but level of abstraction is a huge problem with any kind of simulation. And I don't have a great answer other than like, on the one side you have like maybe a game, and then on the other side you have, your real data.
Mhm.
I do.
I,
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, one of my sort of hunches about how Web3 and AI are complementary is that I broadly think that Web3, in a way, is about heuristics. And the heuristic that we're all traditionally trained on is like my bank account balance. I want my bank account balance to go up. But in Web3, we now have like an internet native heuristic, which is my token balance.
Mhm.
And then AIs are kind of about heuristic maximalization in a way, which is like, how do I make the most intelligent strategy to maximize that heuristic? And so I applied to this project, sort of the insight was, um, if you give an LLM or an AI a token balance and you just say make number go up, either your own token balance or the token balance against, let's call it ETH or USDC or something like that,
Yep.
you would get all sorts of interesting behaviors. But just as a way of creating the multi-agent system and moving towards like more advanced reflexive behaviors versus rule-based behaviors, there's like a ladder up there in
Yeah.
terms of realism. So yeah, just the insight there was heuristics versus heuristic maximalization. I'm kind of thinking that's increasingly how AI and Web3 fit together.
Do you think that the DAO itself could have, a heuristic beyond, token go up? Do you think that these organizations, have clear enough missions or strong enough missions that it is something you could embody in the actual, sort of rules? For example, like the DAO could be set to maximize the token balances, or it could be set to, try to redistribute the most income to its members and not care about having its own balance be high, or it could just try to
Right.
survive. I could imagine a bunch of different sort of goals for the DAO itself. I wonder what you think.
Yeah. Yeah, what does Balaji say in the network state book is that all of these network states have their one commandment, which is the thing that they think is wrong with the world that their network's trying to change. And the toy example he gives is like, people think that we should be eating keto, and so like there'll be like a keto network state. The one that I'm more familiar with is Gitcoin, and their mission is to fund what matters. So basically to create coordination tools that fund what matters. And you kind of get into like AI alignment here, because the token balance will be expressed programmatically on chain, but then the mission can only be expressed socially, and it's almost like mimetic social reflexive dynamics versus token economic reflexive dynamics. How do you create a strange attractor that aligns both of those things, as opposed to creating opposite, like ones that won't hold together? um so yeah, I think that you want to have, you probably have DAOs that have a one commandment that's strong, and you have DAOs that have no one commandment or a weak one commandment, and the agents will act differently based off of that.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yeah, I could imagine if for Gitcoin, for example, you would want it to try to maximize its number of projects, and then you'd build in some sort of rating for the impactfulness of projects and have it try to, maximize that as well. Um, I think that's going to be super cool once we get that up and running. I think most people are trying to maximize for coins alone. And then I love the idea of being able to balance between that. Like maybe we're, 80% mission driven, but 20%, coin driven. I don't think it's a total either or. You
Yeah.
can kind of mix between those.
Well, I just feel like it's something. Maybe a meta commentary is on the boundary conditions of the agent based system, because I don't know. Say you were trying to model MakerDAO. Their primary product is a stablecoin called DAI, and MKR is a secondary token which you can invest in, or purchase, that helps create the stability of DAI, and allows you to set the parameters on the system. And then you've got the governance forums on top of that,
Mm-hmm.
and you can agent based model all of those things. I suppose, given an EVM and in this toolkit, but in a way you can't even model the market success of that DAO without
Also
modeling the rest
modeling
of
the
the whole
market.
Web3
Yeah.
ecosystem. Yeah,
And at which point, if you have a simulation that'll simulate a DAO that good, why don't you just simulate the whole stock market and call it a day, right?
yeah. So yeah, feature request, James. Can we just simulate all of Web3?
I'm
Is, I
I'm
think, the
down.
ultimate scope creep of all of this. um,
Absolutely.
with enough computing power, I'm sure that someone
Yeah,
could, but I I
can I
do
pick
think
up
it's
on
it's
something you said right there? I thought was super interesting. You mentioned maybe running an EVM inside of it, and that hadn't occurred to me. Is that like, so this developer agent that we're making, you actually could like set it up so that it had an EVM that it had access to, and maybe you give it an LLM and you let it write code of some kind. I find that very interesting. The idea of actually like having some agents that can run some Solidity code, because that is what people at these DAOs are doing ultimately.
so in a large enough self-correcting system, would the LLM discover code audits and reentrancy attacks and all of those type of things?
Well, and social engineering attacks, I think, would be interesting because it's going to be getting all of this
Yes.
other stuff from the DAO as well. Yeah, that's let
Hmm.
me write a note down. This is good stuff.
What's the analog in, like, I was watching the DeepMind documentary about Go, and how there had been sort of these human Go players that have a cognitive limit to how far ahead they can think, but the AIs didn't have that cognitive limit, and so they could explore the possibility space, and they were discovering new moves that the human players had never really ever thought of. And I think that that's where it gets interesting with these AI based systems.
Um, totally. I'm ready to like press go on the simulation, sit back, like, take a look at the graphs or readout and just be like, holy crap, like what's going on here? I think that's the moment
Right.
that I'm shooting for, certainly. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I guess, one of my next questions for you is, like, is how you want to monetize this? I mean, I can see you very obvious, like a very obvious business model for you with this would be going to DAO X and saying, "Hey, I could simulate your governance, and I could simulate a bunch of things about your DAO. Um, you know, pay me X number of tokens, and I'll simulate your DAO, and we can make recommendations about how you should evolve your DAO forward based off of what the AI model comes back." But it also, I know this is an open source piece of code, so I hope to see it on Gitcoin grants in the future. It feels like you're building a public good for the space if this thing reaches any level of usefulness for DAOs to be able to simulate their upgrades.
Man, that'd be so cool if somebody helped me build some sort of module that let you plug in your actual DAO information on the top of this. That would be amazing.
Probably just training data. And I mean, at my level of abstraction, it's just training data. I know that there's probably a lot of things you'd have to change, but
Totally. So monetization is interesting. With a project like this, yeah, the consulting route, DAOs do pay a lot of money to people to come in and do the salaries are sometimes like $1 million to have someone come into your DAO and help you make a decision because there's a lot of money at stake. So, maybe we're not going to offer or through this simulation be able to give you, 100% efficacy of what you'd get from a consultant like that. But if we can give you 70% at, 1% of the cost, I think that's a pretty good trade-off. So one interesting thing I kind of mentioned earlier is this slider between the gamification or not. I actually think one cool way to maybe make some money off of this would be to turn it into a game. So at every time step, you would, add some goals, add some options for what the player can do, and then, simulation games are a pretty big genre. There's a lot of people who play those already, and this would be another cool advanced simulation game that's kind of Web3 focused. And so, like, a blockchain focused game that's not actually on the blockchain but dealing with blockchain topics, I think could be pretty successful. Um, I think everybody the past couple of weeks has been freaking out about this paper that came out where some researchers took ChatGPT agents and they put them all in a little town, and they threw a birthday party for one of the other agents. And people are like very excited about that, and that seems like very table stakes for me. Like, oh, I was
Right.
surprised, I guess is what I should say. It's like people were like that excited about these agents planning birthday parties. I think like if you could give someone the ability to come in and play out their fantasy of like, I'm, the number one contributor to a DAO, or like I'm a super smart DAO investor, or like I'm an incredible delegator, I know just who to give my tokens to make things happen. um, I think that there's a way to monetize that. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Well, I
something
know
different.
I think that what comes to mind for me is when I was a kid, we used to watch this show. It was called BattleBots, and it was just like people who had built different robots, so they would
Oh yeah,
fight each other. And I'm almost imagining like the entertainment value of having people fight in the DAO governance forum, and they're just like battle bots but for DAO governance, I think would be all like interesting. And my like
yeah,
emotive effect of like my friends are fighting in the forum is way different than like something I'm emotionally detached to. Is like, oh, look at the meta of this DAO governance uh like bot battle that's happening in the governance forum. There's almost like an entertainment monetization or entertainment selling point there. Like if people are joining in to look at agent birthday parties, then I'm sure that governance forum
well, yeah, they'll be into like
fights would be
corporate raiding and all the weird stuff these agents are going to do once they get going. Vampire attacks on other chains. Like, I think that would be fun to watch. And um, these models run headless. You're, in Python, you're just running a step and it's outputting some data, and you can visualize that data with like network graphs and different kinds of visualizations. Um, but some kind of like visual on top, some Sims kind of thing. I think it could make money that way. Obviously, just like what I learn and others learn who are like heavy users of a product like this, I think they'll very quickly start to have an intuition backed by synthetic data, perhaps backed by real world data as well, into what works. Um, and I think people like that will become you know valuable DAO members. Like this tool should let you on a personal level go into a DAO, set it up, model a change that you want to make, and come to that DAO with some evidence that says like, hey, we should make this change because when I run it through the models in all these different scenarios, it shows us all doubling our money. Like I think you'll get more votes for something like that. So on a personal level, like
Mm.
I guess I could use it to just make my own DAO investing like really sharp and try to monetize it that way. Um, but that seems not as fun as building stuff to me. Um,
Yeah, totally.
so I don't know. Do you have any
Well,
thoughts? What do you think?
I mean, I just think that this is just such an interesting and novel and important design space. I think that there's many implications and paths that this could go down. But I mean, for me, I hope that one of the results of this podcast is that uh we've got 5,000 listeners, between 5 and 7 depending on the episode, and I'm hopeful that like if just 1% of them check out your GitHub and they're like, oh, I'd like to
That would be amazing.
hook up with James and run a simulation against my DAO. You get more interesting, I think, results partnering up with the existing DAOs and helping them solve their problems than just sort of building this in the abstract. This is such a wide design space. Maybe eventually it'll be generalizable to all DAOs, but just like hooking up with existing DAOs and helping them with their needs. I think that'll get
Nice.
this to the next stage of maturity.
I think that's right on. I have been building in the wilderness a little bit. It is an abstraction, right? I'm not an
Yeah.
active member of a bunch of DAOs. My friend who I spoke about the idea with, who pointed out your tweet to me, his name is Dane Lund. He was the DAO architect at Alliance DAO, and now I think he does like the governance stuff for Optimism, but he's not like on their board. And he this was about a year ago now, we talked about it. He gave me a lot of the insight into the DAO side of things. Then I took it and I've
Right.
just been building. And yes, I'm totally at the point now where I'm like, but what does this mean in terms of DAOs? Like, what should I add? Even like the steps that the DAO is doing when I say like it's, redistributing tokens, or it's doing buybacks, or it's staking. Some of that stuff, like I haven't sort of like an intellectual understanding, but I don't have any of the ground level, like, oh yeah, we implemented staking. Here's what it was like. And that's the sort of stuff I would love if your community brought that to us and they're like, oh yeah, this step where you're planning on doing staking, like here's these other 3 things you didn't even know about. That would be amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And take that, and there's staking, and then there's protocol upgrades, and then there's, I want to introduce quadratic funding to this community and see how it changes things. I think there's a lot of opportunity for people who are building DAO tooling to come here and hook in and say, hey, in 100 different simulations, our tool increases the coordination carrying capacity and the token price in the DAO 97% of the time, or something
Yeah.
like that. Like
There's
that
nothing
symbiotic
out there
relationship.
for that, right? There's nothing to tell you whether a decision you're making, and I don't know if we'll get to good or bad totally, but just like what any of the implications of it are. And I have the sense that that is valuable. That's why I thought about the idea. That's why when I heard you post about it, I wanted to get in touch.
Yeah.
I'm not a DAO owner or anything, member, I guess that would be better.
Mhm.
Actively right now, so I don't actually know. And yeah, there's a certain point where like I need to talk to users, and that point is now. So it's exciting. When you say monetizing it, one uh okay, I don't know if this is a good or bad idea, but what if like some part of the model was like on chain and like, I guess I'm thinking more of like if you were going to do kind of like a pay per use thing or something, maybe it would be interesting to like you could deploy this model on your own blockchain or something. Like it could it depends how much information people want to reveal about their own stuff. Maybe you have to use ZK so people aren't revealing, private company info, but yeah, as far as like would I want to run it as a software as a service or a game, it's totally unclear. Software as a service seems hard and like on chain to me. But that was just something an idea that came through my head. I thought I should throw out there while we're
So,
talking.
totally, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the whole, you open source the code so that people can develop on top of it, and the network of that is valuable, but then you sell a SaaS tool that's linked to it. But, to me, the hard part of this will probably just, I've got a passing experience running AI agents, is just that they consume a lot of compute power. And
Mm.
so if you can abstract away the need to spin up a bunch of cloud servers behind a SaaS offering, I think people will pay for that. But it depends on what we're talking about here. Are we going to simulate the whole Web3 ecosystem, or just a
Right.
DAO within that? And depends on whether or not my feature creep of trying to get you to simulate all of Web3
Oh.
makes it into the code base or not.
I think we're gonna have to at least make the next agent. I think we'll make as a forum. Like I find it very interesting that most of the communication that happens in these DAOs is forum based. Text based,
Yeah.
sort of threaded conversations. Um, and so, yeah, I don't know if we'll need to model all of everything, but we probably will need a fairly robust model of a chat forum, which I find kind of interesting. Um, and I have no idea
Yeah.
what will happen once you let a bunch of bots bots chat with each other there, but it'll be fun. And I like the idea that like we'll be able to like pull the headlines of their posts or whatever. You'll see that they're getting 200 replies on a post like we should change to quadratic funding, or like who knows how the bots are going to write. Maybe it'll be like quadratic funding, bunch of emojis. Like I'm hoping they're weird and cool.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be weird. We'll see if they're cool, if they learn coolness. But yeah, you get into some questions about how would you model a social space for a digital, like the just having been involved in DAOs, I think that the governance forum is where the formal governance happens. But I learned this thing about organizations. Oh man, like 15 years ago, one of my mentors taught me that like, hey, the real culture of this is not within the meetings; it's in the hallways and like in the happy hours and what people actually say to each other when they're not afraid of reprisals from the boss. And that
Yeah.
makes me think, oh, well, the DAOs can fight in the governance forum, but what are they Discord DMing to each other and what are they tweeting about? And so
Mm.
simulating those social spaces is, it seems complicated, but with LLMs, it actually feels
Newly easier. Yeah, the
doable.
past, even when we first
Yeah.
started talking a couple months ago, things hadn't tipped quite as far as they have now. That it does seem more approachable to model the sort of softer social spaces. Like yeah, I'm like, well, I guess I gotta add a Twitter simulation and like a little bit of a Discord one. um
Yeah.
it's
I
amazing.
think that there's a lot of possibilities here, and I'm curious to see how the project evolves. And so there's big ambitions of being able to simulate lots of different things in Web3 before we actually put our tokens and our time into them. But I think starting small, and hopefully you pick up a couple interesting relationships with DAOs from this episode,
Yeah,
is where I see this going. And then would love to have you back. I mean, if this continues going, then would love to have you back in Q3 or Q4 and just
yeah.
see how DAO simulation has evolved as a category that you're creating.
Oh my god.
So
Oh, creating a category, my stomach dropped a little bit when you say that. But like it is cool. Like I really appreciate you starting to accumulate gravity towards this idea. It's an idea I had had before, but it was kind of floating. Once you grounded it, and now there's code. Now we have this discussion. There's something for people to look at. I'm super excited about where it's going to go. I had a couple quick questions for you, maybe just around what
yeah.
are like the features you would want to see in a DAO simulator, or do you have like specific questions you would want to answer, or do you just imagine like the coolness of getting there and playing around with it? Um, yeah, what can I do for you so next time we meet, it's
Yeah.
something that you'd like?
Well, I'm no longer super involved in any DAOs since I've disaffiliated from Gitcoin DAO leadership. But I mean, I do think that the problem space that I see around DAOs is what are the initial starting conditions that we want to configure our DAO, and there's like proposal thresholds of you needed at least X amount of tokens to vote, or sorry, X amount of tokens to submit a proposal, Y amount of tokens in order for a proposal to pass. There's just basic questions about what are the starting conditions of my DAO that people have that I think if you can inform them on, then I think that you add a lot of value. I know a lot of people in the DAO tooling space that are saying if you integrate my tool X, it will help your DAO Y in some way. And if you could prove that out in a simulation, I think that that gets really interesting. Um, and then there's just like there's the pure entertainment aspect of having the battle bots and having them fight in the forums and see how the meta of that evolves. And so I think that those are some interesting threads for you to pull.
Yeah, thanks. That is the plan right now, is to pursue it. I do work full time as a senior technical artist. Right now, I'm
Yeah.
contracting with Meta. I also work on chain games with some friends of mine. We have a company. We're building on chain games. We should talk about that separately at some point. But that's been a real wild ride as well. But I am going. So my interest in this came from a class that I took from the Santa Fe Institute. They're this cool
Mm.
complexity think tank based in Santa Fe, and I took their agent-based modeling course. They're the ones, they have a tutorial on this Python Mesa language, so that's how I got exposed
Mhm.
to like, oh, I can build this stuff in Python. but I'm actually going out there for a conference on collective intelligence in June. And I'm going
Mm.
to talk about, not like officially talk about the DAO simulator, but be able to discuss that with people who get agent-based modeling and get this complexity stuff. And I'm just really excited um, to bring that there and get feedback and sort of a lot of people are very focused. Organizations are something people have studied for a long time, but there's very little research into these digital versions of them yet. And I think like
Yeah.
the DAO, the A came across as autonomous, and I think that put a lot of people off in the beginning. From the DAO, it seemed like this thing that was totally sort of separate from people, that it was just all code. But now I think the important part is the decentralized aspect of that. If you think about this as like a decentralized company, you look at what happened during the pandemic, how things have spread out, how everybody's worked from home now. I think it's like an inevitability that most of this stuff will, call it 5 years, 10, 20 years, most organizations will be decentralized. And so, we have a chance
Mm.
to learn about this stuff now and sort of get it out of the gate on a good foot with some tools where we can like perhaps avoid shooting ourselves in the foot as badly as we have with some other public goods, I guess.
Yeah, I feel that. And it's a great point about the prescience of this opportunity in this moment. But I'm also just in it for the nerd snipe of experimenting with how AI and DAOs fit together in digitally native organizations. It's just a fun design space to
Well,
explore.
and this has got all the things. It's got agents, it's got LLMs, you've got procedural content generation, large language models. There's like just so much fun stuff in here. You throw it all together in the Python soup, and I think we're gonna see some really interesting things. So yeah, if you're out there and listening and you have a DAO and you'd like to model it or help me figure that out, I would love for you to reach out. Uh,
Yeah,
Make some
and click the
comments on the GitHub.
absolutely. So click the link in the show notes for the GitHub repo and get in touch with James. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to tell us, James, before we wrap?
Um, on your on the prep sheet, you had a couple questions. One was about a period of time that I found interesting, like a history kind of thing, Silicon
Hmm.
Valley history maybe. And I had an experience recently where I kind of got plugged into that I just thought might be kind of interesting to share. I make interactive art, and I got reached out to by an older interactive artist. His name is Larry Cuba. I went to grad school at UC Santa Cruz. He is affiliated with them, and he on the original Star Wars in 1977 made the visuals for the Death Star that you see when they're like showing it to the Rebel
Hmm.
pilots. And he did that at the time all real time. He made this like crazy thing where he could like turn the knobs and it would like change, like definitely kind of like over engineered for what they ended up using in the movie, but just really incredible. And he's been making procedural art since then. Instead of going like the VFX route, he kind of stayed the more fine art route, and he is working on some new like procedural content systems and needed some help. And it was really cool to plug into an older generation of programmer and engineer and to just realize like here's a person, like a very talented programmer and coder. They just don't know the latest tricks or they don't know the syntax for Blender. And so he had been blocked for a couple of years on making stuff. And so I've been able to work with him, get him unblocked, get him building stuff again, which is for me as an artist and software engineer, I found very satisfying. And it
Hmm.
plugs me into this history in an interesting way, which is that Larry Cuba, one of his mentors was this guy, John Whitney Sr., who's like one of the first people to ever do animation on a computer. So like
Yeah.
now all of a sudden I'm like 2 steps away from the first computer animation. And I find that like very exciting. So if your readers have a chance, look him up, Larry Cuba. He's got super cool art. Um, that's maybe like a little different than the Unix Bell Lab stuff, but he was so creative that they like asked him to do this stuff on this huge movie. And then I just think like taking it instead of the VFX direction in the fine art direction was a really interesting choice. And it's led him to some very different places than people, he could have gone and started ILM, I guess, or gone there after it. So
ILM being Industrial Light and Magic, the famous
Industrial Light
gaming
and Magic,
university.
yeah, which sort of came out of that. A lot of people ended up going and working on that. So yeah, that was just a neat experience getting plugged into the history of things, and it happened very quickly. I went from having no connection to like the history of computer art to like being a couple steps away from the beginning. And I'll just encourage people, be available, post about your skills and what you do. Like he reached out to me because on my LinkedIn, I said I do some Python and Blender, and another professor from there saw it. And those things don't happen, luck comes and greets the prepared, I guess. So, we had
Yeah.
a discussion about before the call started about whether to, I was like a little nervous about like, should I open source this code? Should I not? And actually, like, as we've gone through this conversation, I think I made the right decision. Like, the prep is there, it's out in the
Yeah.
open now, the light is
Well,
on. Let's hope it brings the right
well,
fireflies.
yeah. Well, if you're listening to this, this is the this is us dropping the story of James open sourcing the code 5 minutes before we're recording, so that I could send people to it in the show notes. So you YOLO'd, you gave it to the universe, and I hope that the universe reciprocates with code contributions and mimetic love, and hopefully people hire you to simulate your DAO as well. But
Cool. Well, thank you.
yeah, and yeah, and plus one on. I mean, I think we're all standing on the shoulders of giants here. I think about the forefathers of open source software and how they beat Microsoft in the '90s to make every web server open source, and it could have gone so differently. We could all be using like Clippy phones and Clippy
Yeah.
coins instead of Bitcoin and stuff like that. So we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and I take inspiration from the lineage of people that have inspired me, as it seems like you do as
Yeah.
well. And
Well,
maybe in another generation, people be like, well, I got connected to James, the first author of a DAO AI
oh my God.
framework. So that's all we can hope for.
Gonna make me blush. Yeah, and I have to say, like, I'm a product of public goods. I'm the first one from my family to go to college. My undergrad was private, but I went to public graduate school. I learned everything I know from the internet. And I never met my dad, so like how to tie a tie, to how to code. So I'm a big believer in information and its desire to be free, and all the cool things people can do with that. So thanks for the opportunity to
Yeah.
come and tell people about what I'm working on, and hopefully draw some new folks in.
Yeah. Well, thanks for turning the meme of AI DAO simulators from just a meme into actual code. Excited
That's
to
what
see
I
where it
mean. You
goes.
put it out there, and sometimes the world just makes it happen. It's cool.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end it. James, thanks for joining, and keep up the great work.
Peace. Thank you, Kevin.
Peace and love.